Draw something for me. You're not going to turn it in, so no homework. You wouldn't want to see my drawings either. But if you were to draw a house, what would it look like? Just draw a simple house, just for a moment, or a room. Just something simple. Now, some of you would be more elaborate than others, and others are already finished. It doesn't matter. Here's the point. If your grief that you have presently was like a room, how big would it be? How big would your grief room be? Would it be a 6x8? Or would it be, what is this? About a 30 by 60, 80? Would it be a huge room? And you say, well, what's the point? The point is that there are ways in which we grieve. And there are ways in which we grieve that allows others to be a part of our grief journey or not a part of our grief journey. There's not a right way, there's not a wrong way, there's just your way. But if grief was like a room in your grief journey, how big would it be? Again, you're the only one that can answer that. But in that grief room, would you have windows in that room? Are you willing to realize that there is another world out there, that there is the sunshine, that there are the trees that are living? Or would you just really not want to have that in your grief room because right now you can't think in those ways? And how would you furnish your grief room? What kind of chairs would you have in your grief room? How open are you to allowing people to come in to your life and share with you your grief? Would you have a church pew? Because you're just open to about anybody. Or would you have a strata lounger on your side, but a straight chair for them to sit in? Because you're not ready for people to come and stay a long time in your grief. Again, there's not a right way, there's not a wrong way, there's your way. What kind of door would you have to that grief room? Remember those old country-fashioned swinging doors that you could see through, and you know there's not even a lock on them, and just wide open? Or are you going to have a steel door with a doorknob on your side, but not on their side, with a peephole? Because right now you're a little concerned about who you might allow into your grief, who you might allow into your journey, who you might be willing to talk to. And so again, what kind of door would you have? We've talked about the chairs. What other accessories would you have in your grief room? Would there be a Bible? Would there be a telephone? Would there be other things? Bill McDonald came up with this concept that we all have grief rooms, but they all look differently. What I want to do is with the table here, I'm going to show you a few grief rooms that over the years, people who've been a part of my grief class or in recent times when we have gone different places, have given me their thoughts about their grief rooms, with the idea that during the break, after we finish this, if you want to come and take pictures of these grief rooms as you're thinking about your own grief room, feel free to do so. A lady in Orlando, Florida last year when we were there said, I have 2 grief rooms. My sewing room where I always sewed things, and then next to that was the living room where my husband would be sitting in a recliner watching TV, but we were so close to each other we'd talk back and forth. And said after he died, I couldn't go to the sewing room alone anymore. That was just too desolate. And so what I did was I moved my sewing room into the TV room. And I sit in his recliner and I sew. And the whole time I'm sewing, I'm thinking about him. So you see what she did. She just combined 2 rooms into one. In Chattanooga, Tennessee, an elder who lost his wife after a long time said, my grief room was and still is the elder's office, where now, even though I'm a former elder, I can go into that room with those men and I can cry with them and I can talk to them about the pain of my loss, and I can receive hugs and tears and know that I am loved and cared for. Isn't that sweet? That's the way it ought to be. And he said, my grief room is the elder's office that they have. I have another friend that is an elder, and he said, my grief room are cemeteries. I go to cemeteries to look up and take pictures of folks that have died and then send that information to families that might not have known their loved ones are there. And while I am there, I'll think about my own losses, the loss of my parents, the loss of our daughter. And so he says, my grief room are cemeteries. This lady would worship with us and sit right behind where Lisa and I sit. And she had a grief corner. Her husband was in the war, and so this grief corner shows pictures of them and their family and him in the armed services and the American flag that they gave at the funeral. And then on the back, special remembrances of Duell. That was his name, Duell James. And so that was very interesting. She just recently passed away, but that was her grief room. This was interesting because they name, and you have to read all the fine print, but they name all the different things in their house that is a part of their grief room. And what I loved about this is at the very center of this entire house, there was Mama's couch. And that was at the center of their place. And so that was her particular grief room. This lady lost parents and also a brother, and so she has different places on her grief room. And then outside is a cemetery where sometimes she would go, and she has a picture of her angel mom, her angel dad, her angel brother. And so that's the room that she drew. This lady lost her son. And so there is a pedestal, and there are pictures of him. And also, he was a singer. And so in the background of her grief room, where she thinks about the loss of her brother, her sister, and her mother, there is the music that he played that is a part of her grief experience. And Miss Patty even put her name on this one. And I thought that was interesting. This lady talked about her grief room she lost her brother, who was a song leader in the church. And this is what she said: "My grief room is filled with windows and an open door. It welcomes anybody who would like to come and talk about my brother. Lights are not needed. Memories completely light up the room. Music is abundant in the room. Favorite hymns can be heard at any time." So hers was sort of like a place where people could come and talk about her brother. And there could be the church songs in the background. And that was something. This fellow was a deacon of the church where I preached for 14 years. And his wife got dementia. And he took good care of her. And I've been at this home many times around that table. They had 5 children. But he would talk about the different family members. And so his grief room would be his entire house. And he has places where everybody sat and where pictures were made. This lady has a recliner and a Bible and a telephone in her grief room and 1 chair. And she talked about the pain that she felt and the door that was there available that she could go to. This lady also had a grief room, but then there were also the woods and a gazebo outside. And she said, out there in the woods, this is where I go to scream and cry and vent my feelings. But what I loved about this one is that she has a church bench. And she said, this is where all my friends are welcome to come in and talk about my grief. And so I thought that was pretty neat. What is interesting about this one is that door that I was telling you about, in terms of your accessibility of allowing people into your grief, she has a revolving door. And so that's her door, because she says everyone is welcome. And she has different things, and you can look at some of the different things that she said about hers that I thought was pretty neat. This lady talked about her old grief room, and then on the back side talked about her new grief room. She said, this room was small when I actually looked at it. Not really a place I wanted to spend time. It had no windows. There's a door frame, but no door. When thinking about it, I realized that it had shelves with boxes on them. Each box was labeled with a loss. For some reason, the boxes all seemed to be the same size, but in fact, some were large and much heavier than others. They were dusty, even though they had been there for many years. The room had no tables or chairs. It was a place of remembrance, but I didn't desire to spend time in it. I did, however, take a box from this room from time to time and carry it around for a while. I didn't even know I had this room until I came to our grief support class. But then on the backside, she said, now my new grief room. I've made the decision to remodel a room I didn't even know I had. I don't call it a room now, it's more a porch. It still has a roof for protection, but there's sun streaming in on all sides. There's a lovely, sweet fragrance that fills the air. A carpet of green grass is all around. There are still shelves, but now they are bowed baskets made of spun glass. They are beautiful but fragile. Each basket holds a loss, but each loss is wrapped in a blanket of love. I'll build each one carefully from time to time, then give them back to the Father. He knows each one of them, and he holds them in his heart. His timing is perfect. When I am ready, he will help me understand each one in time or in eternity. Notice the difference between her old grief room and the new grief room. Basically, the way she looked at things. That was the whole idea. This lady said, my grief room were always a phone call away. In cancer, they talk about your 2 a.m. friends. Who can you call at 2 o'clock and you know that they'll listen? And so she says, my friends are just a phone call away. Seldom ever I'm without a phone buddy who's lonely like I am. We spend many hours on the phone these past few years. We are great friends. I thank God for my family and friends. This one's interesting because it's drawn by a 10-year-old girl. This little girl was going down the road with her granddaddy in the front seat of the truck when he had a terrible heart attack. So much to the point that he could no longer drive the vehicle. Thankfully, she grabbed the wheel and was able to stop the vehicle before they got hurt. But in this, she has pictures of chairs for her school friends, and she shows that. And I thought that was really neat of this little girl, that in the midst of her sadness, she had pictures and she had ways in which she could describe her grief. This fellow, who was very, very smart, had 3 separations in his grief room. My safe alone space over here on the side, the dining room table that only has 4 chairs in it, suggesting the idea that he's a little careful about who he allows in. And then the TV room where they sit and talk about other things. And he talked about the 3 grief spaces that he had in his grief room. This person describes their grief room in this way. I really don't have a grief room, but after thinking about it, I've decided there are 3 places I grieve or have serious thinking or decision making. The 3 places are my front porch swing, my van, and the ocean. I go to the front porch and sit in my swing when I feel emotional, need to be alone, or want to talk to God. Sometimes I want my husband or my sister to be on the front porch with me, but mostly I just want to be there alone. I do a lot of thinking and grieving and decision making when I'm alone, driving down the road in my van. Maybe that's the reason I'm not such a good driver. My thoughts are sometimes somewhere else. I love the ocean, especially an ocean uncluttered with tourism. I like to think it's just me and my ocean. I feel closer to God at the ocean. Usually I want my husband on the beach with me, but mostly I like being there alone. And so that was what that particular person drew. This was really sad. One year, when I do the 10-week class, I never know who's going to show up until they show up. But that particular year, we had up to 33 people come to be a part of the class. And 7 of the couples that were there were all there because of suicide. I don't know if they'd gotten together and decided to come or not, but 7 families were dealing with this. And this particular lady drew a picture of them after supper in the garage. And they're sitting there alone. And you can see a sad look on their face, because she's hoping that friends or family will come to visit them. And she said that many times they did not. Over here is a light post. And that light post was not supposed to work. But sometimes when they would go out there, mysteriously it would come on. And they wondered if that was a sign from their son that had taken his life. This lady was an artist, and she draws all kinds of trees in her grief journey. She names them all kinds of different things: grace and darkness and despair and other things. And then she said, grief is like a desolate field of dead trees yearning to learn to live again. This one has as their grief room a big swing and an arbor and the outside. And she said, that's where I go and that's where I think about my loved ones. This lady from Mississippi had her grief room. There's 1 chair inside. There's 1 chair on the outside. She has trees. She has other things. But that 1 outside chair suggests the idea that she's right now a little guarded about her grief and just allow a few people. This lady really took it seriously. She has scaled a model. I mean, literally, she went to the computer and worked on it. Her husband had died. He was a song leader in the church. She has a place where his ties and where his pitch pipe were, where the last clothes that he wore were. And she describes her first month of grief in that room and the friends that she would allow. What I'm trying to say is this: we all have a grief room, whether we know we do or not. It may not be a literal room. There may be a place in your house where you've got pictures of your loved ones that you may talk to them or they may talk to you. But we all have a grief room. It's not an actual place, although it could be, but it's the way in which we grieve. It may be that we grieve and we allow everyone to be a part of it. It may be that there's just certain family that we allow to be in our grief journey. It may be that, our grief journey will consist of our minister and some elders and some folks that are just like brothers and sisters to us. Not a right way, not a wrong way, your way. Your homework, if you should choose to do so, is to draw your grief room. Or write it out if you want to do it that way. Or in your mind, think about, if my grief was like a room, how big would it be? If you want to show me tomorrow, that's awesome. You don't have to. It's just yours. But sometimes it helps to think about it by looking at pictures. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take about a 10-minute break. And then we're going to come back for the last session. And my plan is for us to be out of here by 12 o'clock unless you want to stay around and talk, which I'd be more than glad to do so. But if you want to come and look at some of these, look at some of the things that they wrote about their grief, they're willing to share that with you, and you can do that. If you want to take pictures, that's fine as well. But we're going to take one more break, and then we're going to come back and talk about how to make it through the grief journey. So let's do that right now.